Once the top story in the news, the war in Ukraine has now faded from the headlines as global attention shifts to other crises, such as the conflict in Gaza. This war, which erupted in 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea and spread to eastern Ukraine, has dragged on for years with devastating effects. Despite continued fighting and numerous peace talks, there seemed to be no end in sight. However, recent developments have shown that the US and Europe have finally come to a stark realization. There is no way for Ukraine to win this war against the far more powerful Russian military. This understanding has profound implications for Ukraine's future. As the stalemate drags on, the focus is shifting towards what this means for the people of Ukraine and the country's prospects. In light of these events, it is important to examine how the war in Ukraine is now essentially over, not through a decisive victory, but through a grim acknowledgement of reality. What does this turning point mean for Ukraine? What will happen next as the international community recalibrates its approach? Join us as we delve into these questions and explore the future of Ukraine in this new, uncertain chapter. Over the past 2 years, the US government has invested heavily in supporting Ukraine, channeling vast sums of money and extensive military aid in an attempt to shift the war's balance against Russia. This effort has involved spending hundreds of billions of dollars on military assistance, which has significantly depleted the US's own ammunition reserves to equip Ukrainian forces. Additionally, the US has mobilized its Western allies to impose stringent sanctions on Russia, aiming to cripple its economy and pressure it into withdrawing from the conflict. Throughout this period, Western media outlets have largely echoed the US government's stance, promoting a narrative that suggests Ukraine is on the path to victory, President Putin is on the defensive, and the Russian economy is teetering on the edge of collapse. However, this portrayal is far from accurate. Despite the severe sanctions, Russia has not been isolated as intended. Instead, the Russian economy has shown resilience, bouncing back from the initial shocks. Moreover, Russia remains steadfast, showing no indication of retreating from the conflict. This stark contrast between the narrative and the reality highlights the complexities and challenges of the ongoing war in Ukraine. One of the primary reasons behind the failure of sanctions against Russia is the lack of widespread international support. Among the 193 member states of the United Nations, only a fraction, 28 countries, have chosen to impose sanctions on Russia. The majority of nations, including influential powers such as India, China, Brazil, and South Africa, have either upheld their existing trade relationships with Russia or even intensified cooperation. This reluctance stems from the belief that sanctions are ineffective and ultimately counterproductive. Moreover, Russia holds strategic significance for many countries, particularly in the energy sector. For instance, prior to the conflict, India imported a relatively small portion, less than 3% of its crude oil from Russia. However, in the wake of the war, this figure has surged dramatically, with India now procuring over 40% of its crude oil from Russia, cementing its position as one of the largest buyers of Russian oil. Even the United States, the chief proponent of sanctions, has maintained clandestine business ties with Russia. According to reports from the New York Times, American corporations are quietly funneling approximately $1 billion annually to Russia's state-owned nuclear agency in exchange for the fuel powering more than half of the United States' nuclear reactors. Another significant factor contributing to the failure of sanctions is the remarkable recovery of the Russian economy following the initial shock of the war. After experiencing a sharp decline in 2022, the Russian ruble has rebounded to its pre-war value against the dollar. Moreover, the Russian government has implemented measures aimed at reducing its reliance on oil and gas exports, thereby diversifying its economy and bolstering domestic production and consumption. Crucially, Russia has positioned itself for a protracted conflict, both militarily and politically. Leveraging its abundant resources and manpower, Russia has mobilized its advanced weaponry and technology while fortifying its strategic position and alliances in the region. Despite Western propaganda and pressure, Russia has successfully maintained domestic support and legitimacy, underscoring its resilience in the face of international scrutiny. On the contrary, the United States and its allies have encountered escalating challenges and hurdles in maintaining their intervention in Ukraine. The US, in particular, has grappled with the daunting task of replenishing its depleted ammunition reserves, which have been significantly drained due to the prolonged conflict. Moreover, the US government has faced mounting criticism and opposition from within its own Republican-dominated Congress. Members of Congress have raised concerns regarding the legality and ethical implications of the ongoing war. In a notable development, President Zelensky of Ukraine recently embarked on a diplomatic mission to Washington, D.C., where he sought to rally support from the US Congress for additional financial aid to sustain his country's struggle against Russia. During his address, President Zelensky candidly acknowledged the stalemate gripping the conflict, lamenting the absence of any discernible progress or resolution on the horizon. He described the situation as entirely stagnant, emphasizing the pressing need for increased assistance from the United States and its allied nations. The recent announcement by the administration to allocate an additional $1 billion of taxpayers' money over the next year to prolong the conflict in Ukraine has ignited a flurry of debate and speculation about the United States' broader intentions and objectives in the region. This decision has prompted many to question the rationale behind such a significant financial commitment, especially in the absence of a clear strategy or defined endgame. Amidst this uncertainty, observers are grappling with fundamental questions about the purpose of continued US involvement in the Ukrainian conflict. While the administration had previously articulated ambitions of achieving a decisive victory, the current lack of clarity regarding its goals has left many bewildered. Instead of pursuing a course aimed at resolving the conflict, it appears that the administration is opting to prolong the status quo, leading to growing skepticism about the efficacy and wisdom of this approach. This shift in rhetoric has raised concerns about the potential consequences of protracted involvement in Ukraine, both in terms of human suffering and geopolitical ramifications. Moreover, it has underscored broader uncertainties surrounding US foreign policy in the region and beyond. As the situation continues to evolve, there is a pressing need for transparency and coherence in the administration's approach, along with a re-evaluation of the underlying objectives guiding US engagement in Ukraine. In a notable departure from previous statements, General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, has made a significant admission. There is no military solution to the conflict in Ukraine. This candid acknowledgement marks a departure from earlier assertions and suggests a sober recognition of the realities on the ground. By conceding the absence of a clear military resolution, General Milley effectively implies an acceptance of the war's protracted nature, characterized by a lack of decisive outcomes and a prolonged state of uncertainty. As the conflict continues to unfold, it has evolved into a test of endurance for both sides involved. The absence of a military solution means that victory cannot be achieved through force alone, and instead, the focus shifts towards maintaining military capabilities over the long term. This shift in perspective underscores the complexities and challenges inherent in the conflict, as well as the uncertainties surrounding its trajectory. With neither side poised for a decisive victory, the war in Ukraine enters a phase characterized by endurance and persistence. This realization prompts observers to contemplate the broader implications of continued US involvement in the conflict. As the situation evolves, questions abound regarding the effectiveness of current strategies, the potential for diplomatic resolution, and the ultimate impact on regional stability and global security. In a recent NBC article, the challenges faced by the United States and its allies in supporting Ukraine during its conflict with Russia were brought to light. While these nations could provide weapons and equipment to Ukraine, there emerged a critical shortage of trained soldiers capable of effectively utilizing them on the battlefield. This deficiency underscored the complexities of the situation, as military hardware alone could not ensure success without adequately skilled personnel to operate it. Moreover, the US and its allies were concurrently grappling with another conflict in the Middle East, diverting attention and resources away from the Ukrainian theater. Ukrainian President Zelensky found himself confronted with the harsh reality that external assistance alone could not guarantee the defense of his country. The shortage of trained soldiers highlighted the limitations of relying solely on military aid from abroad. Zelensky recognized the need for Ukraine to bolster its own military capabilities and reduce dependence on external support to ensure its security and sovereignty. Complicating matters further was the abrupt shift in global attention triggered by Israel's confrontation with Hamas. Historically, Israel has held greater strategic importance for the United States than Ukraine. However, the sudden escalation of conflict in the Middle East overshadowed Ukraine's struggle in the eyes of the international community. Public attention veered away from Ukraine as media focus shifted to the crisis unfolding in Israel. The shift in public opinion regarding U.S. involvement in Ukraine was palpable. A recent poll revealed a significant increase in the percentage of Americans who believe that the U.S. is overly engaged in assisting Ukraine, jumping from 24% to 41% in just 3 months. This surge in skepticism reflects a broader sentiment of wariness regarding the extent of U.S. commitments abroad, especially in light of competing priorities and evolving global crises. In a surprising twist, there's been a shift in the way the United States and European Union are dealing with Ukraine. They've started having secret talks with Ukraine's government. This signals a change in their strategy and suggests they might be considering striking a deal with Russia to officially end the war. According to a report by NBC News, these discussions involve exploring what Ukraine might have to give up to reach an agreement with Russia. This news is significant because it represents a major departure from previous approaches to the conflict. This development is underscored by a notable change in Time magazine's perspective. Just last year, they hailed Ukrainian President Zelensky as the person of the year for his leadership during the crisis. However, in a recent article, Time portrays Zelensky's struggle as a solitary one. They depict him feeling betrayed by his Western allies, with one of his advisors expressing a sense of resignation, saying, "He tricked himself. We have no other choices. We're not winning, but he won't accept that." This shift in narrative reflects the stark reality of the situation and the challenges facing Ukraine as it navigates the complexities of the conflict. The report by NBC News highlights the growing concerns among US and EU officials regarding the escalating tensions between Russia and NATO. These tensions have reached a dangerous level in recent months, raising fears among officials that a miscalculation or provocation could spark a wider conflict with catastrophic consequences for both sides. In light of these risks, there is a willingness among US and EU officials to explore compromises that could ease tensions and prevent further escalation. One potential compromise being considered is granting Russia some level of influence over eastern Ukraine while still upholding Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. However, such a compromise would likely face strong opposition from Ukrainian President Zelensky and his supporters. Zelensky has been steadfast in his refusal to surrender to Russian aggression and has instead called for increased military and economic assistance from the West. Additionally, he has advocated for a clear path to NATO membership for Ukraine as a means of bolstering its security against Russian threats. The differing perspectives and priorities of the parties involved underscore the complex dynamics at play in seeking a resolution to the conflict in Ukraine. The US and EU are reportedly exerting pressure on Ukrainian officials to accept a peace deal that would bring an end to the war with Russia, but at a significant cost. The proposed deal would entail conceding a large portion of Ukrainian territory to the Russian-backed separatists, a prospect that is viewed as deeply humiliating for NATO and the US. At the outset of the conflict, both NATO and the US expressed confidence and ambitious goals, vowing to push Russian forces back to their pre-war borders. However, the current situation suggests a stark reversal of fortunes, with Ukraine facing the prospect of relinquishing approximately 20% of its territory, an area roughly half the size of the UK. In an effort to shape the narrative surrounding the peace deal, the Western media is anticipated to spin the story in a way that downplays any notion of defeat in Ukraine. Instead, they may characterize the outcome as a stalemate, emphasizing NATO's perceived gains, such as the addition of 2 new members, Sweden and Finland, as a result of the conflict. Furthermore, there may be attempts to shift blame onto Ukrainian President Zelensky, with criticisms leveled at his leadership and purported lack of vision. Ultimately, this portrayal may serve to divert attention away from what could be perceived as another failed military intervention by Western powers. The war in Ukraine has unveiled a broader narrative, exposing the vulnerabilities and constraints of the US and NATO. Despite pouring vast resources, amounting to hundreds of billions of dollars, into supporting Ukraine, they have been unable to achieve victory over Russia. This realization challenges the perception of the US and NATO as omnipotent forces on the global stage. While the US may not openly acknowledge its shortcomings in Ukraine, it is already contemplating its next strategic moves. Amidst ongoing conflicts in Ukraine and Israel, some factions within the US, particularly among Republicans, are advocating for a confrontational stance towards China, particularly regarding Taiwan. However, before embarking on such endeavors, it's crucial to confront a fundamental question. If the US struggles to counter Russia, whose economy pales in comparison to China's, how can it realistically expect to compete with or contain China in a potential conflict? For the people of Taiwan, this geopolitical landscape raises important considerations, especially in the lead-up to the 2024 presidential elections. While President Joe Biden has pledged military support in the event of a Chinese invasion, recent events in Ukraine cast doubt on the reliability of such assurances. Taiwanese citizens must carefully weigh their options and elect leaders capable of managing relations with Beijing in a peaceful and pragmatic manner. Relying solely on US security guarantees may prove risky, particularly if it involves being drawn into proxy conflicts orchestrated by external powers seeking to advance their own agendas at Taiwan's expense. The failure in Ukraine has prompted a reckoning within the US, leading people to scrutinize the narratives propagated by the mainstream media. Questions are being raised about the rationale behind the US's massive investment in Ukraine, especially considering the dire state of its own economy. Many are left wondering why billions of dollars were poured into Ukraine with little tangible results, while domestic issues remained unaddressed. Moreover, there is contemplation about what Ukraine's trajectory might have been if the US had heeded the warnings of analysts like John Mearsheimer, who foresaw the consequences of pushing Ukraine towards NATO membership. Mearsheimer had predicted 6 years ago that such actions could ultimately lead to the destabilization and downfall of Ukraine, a prophecy that appears to have materialized. As the US continues to expend vast sums on wars across the globe, there is a growing awareness of alternative approaches pursued by emerging superpowers like China. While the US focuses on military interventions, China is channeling its resources into investments aimed at fostering global development and empowerment. Through initiatives such as the Belt and Road Initiative, China is facilitating infrastructure projects and economic partnerships that enable countries to carve out their place in the evolving global landscape. This shift in perspective underscores the need for the US to reassess its priorities and strategies in a world characterized by multipolarity. It raises fundamental questions about the efficacy of military interventions versus diplomatic and developmental approaches in shaping the global order and advancing national interests. Indeed, the Belt and Road Forum held in Beijing marked a significant milestone, drawing representatives from over 130 countries worldwide. The event celebrated the 10-year anniversary of China's Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, and showcased its achievements in promoting international cooperation and connectivity through infrastructure projects. Coinciding with this grand event, a noteworthy development emerged on the global economic stage. The Chinese yuan officially surpassed the euro to become the world's second most used currency in SWIFT trade settlements. This milestone underscores China's ongoing efforts to enhance the international status of its currency and expand its influence in global financial markets. The convergence of these events highlights China's growing prominence in shaping the global economic landscape. Through initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative and strategic moves to promote the internationalization of the yuan, China is asserting itself as a major player in the international arena. As the world continues to undergo profound transformations, China's expanding influence is reshaping traditional power dynamics and opening up new opportunities for global cooperation and economic development. 2 decades ago, China's economic influence was limited to a handful of countries, but today it has emerged as the top trading partner for over 120 nations globally. This transformation underscores China's remarkable ascent as a dominant force in international trade and commerce. Notably, China's exports to the Muslim world now surpass those to the United States, reflecting its growing economic ties with diverse regions. Additionally, China's export volume to developing countries rivals that of developed markets, further highlighting its expanding footprint in the global economy. The evolving dynamics of global trade and geopolitical shifts, particularly the impasse in Ukraine and perceived failures of the US and NATO, have prompted questions about China's role and influence in this new multipolar world order. With China's increasing prominence on the world stage, there is speculation about whether it stands to benefit the most from the perceived setbacks of the US and NATO in Ukraine. As the geopolitical landscape continues to evolve, the rise of China as a major economic and geopolitical player raises complex questions about power dynamics, strategic alliances, and the future trajectory of international relations.